All I can say here is this market is massive. So if you look at 2022, the combined markets reached 923 billion US dollars. And that's nearly double the size of the global smartphone market.
We're speaking now with Trinh. He is the CEO of DevvStream, and we'll be talking about carbon credits. The voluntary carbon credits market is a very fast-growing industry. How exactly can investors profit from this growth? Welcome to the show. Sunny, it's a pleasure speaking with you on the David Lim Report.
Pleasure to meet you and speak to you as well, too, David.
Tell us a little bit about, first of all, the industry. So carbon credits, we think about carbon credits as something that most people think about it as something that's involuntary, but there's a big voluntary market that's out there that's growing really quickly. So tell us a little bit about the differences between the voluntary and the involuntary markets first.
Yeah, so the way the market works is that there's a voluntary space where there's certain government jurisdictions that don't require or tax corporations for having a certain level of emissions. In those cases, the companies will come in and voluntarily buy carbon credits to offset their emissions because they're getting pressured by their shareholders or their clients or even the community around them. So more and more organizations are doing this because they're getting graded on their ESG scores. And especially it's important because a lot of institutional investors are saying that unless you have a good ESG score, have a reduction in your emissions, they won't invest in your company. So if you want your share price to go up, a lot of these public companies will do that. And then the private companies are having this kind of the same commitments as well, because like I said, their end customers are demanding it also.
And what is the size of this market right now in dollar terms?
Yeah, well, all I can say here is this market is massive, all right? And I tend to combine both the compliance and the voluntary market because that's where DevvStream plays and we play in both. So if you look at 2022, the combined markets reached 923 billion US dollars. And that's nearly double the size of the global smartphone market. From 2018 to 2022, the market grew at a CAGR of roughly 44.3%. And we expect that it could continue growing at this pace, if not faster. So according to McKinsey, the voluntary market itself is expected to increase by a factor of 15x by 2030 and 100x by 2050. And I'll repeat that, 100x by 2030. And the same report from McKinsey also say that for us to meet our global goal to address climate change, we need to reduce emissions by 23 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2030, and even more the following years. And we believe that more than half of this will need to come from the carbon market. So that's over 12 billion carbon credits annually to help address this. And really, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to add, you're absolutely right. It's not just McKinsey, by the way. Morgan Stanley's report that I'm looking at right now, $2 billion market in 2020, $250 billion by 2050. So yeah, about 100x in the next 30 years. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, and really, if you take a step back, why wouldn't it continue to grow, right? Because if you look at all the companies, organizations, and even countries now throughout the world making net zero commitments, again, by 2030 or 2050, pretty much all of them won't be able to meet their commitments without purchasing carbon credits. If you have buildings, factories, transportation, and so on, you're going to have emissions. Unless it comes from renewable energy and everything else is electrified, you have emissions that need to be offset by carbon credits. Several countries already stated that they plan on using carbon credits as a significant portion of their net zero goals.
Which countries do you think are fastest in terms of growth for this market?
For demand for carbon credits, countries like Japan, for example, have stated that a majority of their net zero goals and emission reductions will come from carbon credits, nearly 100%. And then you have larger developed nations like Canada, like the US, where roughly 35% of their reductions and their net zero goals will come from carbon credits as well. And these are the high emitters, so they need to buy a lot of carbon credits.
The offshoot industry from this, or I guess the periphery investment from this is forests. I've been reading some banks like JP Morgan buying up forests as an investment into this sector. Are they betting on either lumber prices going up, or are they betting on the forests and themselves being a integral part of the carbon offsets industry? Why are they doing this? Is my question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I think the investments that companies like JP Morgan are making is great news for the market in general because it shows how viable carbon credits are as an investment. And that's the main reason why these companies and corporations are making these type of investments. They're betting that these forests will be able to sequester carbon and generate carbon credits for the next 30, 40, 50 years as well. And And really, we need to keep in mind that, yes, carbon credits are still a fairly new asset. And like any other new asset class, it takes time for people and companies to understand and accept them. Well, this is a great example of how this asset's being accepted, how viable it is for companies to make this type of investment.
This is an article that I want to bring your attention to. More than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifiers are worthless, analysis shows. Now, this is interesting. I'm just going to be the first paragraph. The forest carbon offsets approved by the world's leading certifier and used by Disney, Shell, Gucci, and other big corporations are largely worthless and could make global heating worse, according to a new investigation. What are they referring to exactly?
Yeah, what they're referring to is that with most of the credits from this organization comes from what's called nature base. And so this includes the forestry projects that like JP Morgan is investing into or mangroves. And one of the issues with nature base is that it's really hard to quantify and give a precise data on how much carbon is being sequestered, right? You take 1,000 acres of forest. How do you know how much carbon is being sequestered? Well, you really don't. So how they quantify is they use models. And because most of the data that's used to quantify the number of credits are done with these models, it's fairly easy to overestimate. On top of that, there's not a lot of transparency around the data and how the projects themselves are quantified. So it makes it really challenging to truly know what you're getting. And so that's why there's claims that there's a lot of overestimation going on. You hear the terms greenwashing. And this is also why technology is so important. And that's why DevStream is focusing on technology. Because with technology, it's inherently, one of the inherent benefits is that the data from technology is very precise and very predictable, which is very different from the nature-based side.
So if I were an investor, what are the options I could take to be directly exposed to carbon offsets?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now, there's not a lot of options. There's 4 companies, public companies in Canada that focus on carbon streaming and carbon projects. And the other 3 outside of DevStream focus, again, on the nature-based side. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with nature-based. It's just, it's a different focus, a different area. And there's the potential for the greenwashing, like we just talked about in the article. Where DevStream focuses on is mainly technology-based. Technology-based solutions that are, again, very precise. It's very broad as well. We cover everything from plugging oil wells to EV charging to building efficiencies. And it gives a lot wider diversification of the type of credits, which we believe will increase in value as well.
But there's no futures market that I can participate in?
Right now, there's not a futures market. We hope to have that in the again in the near future, no pun intended. But that's why one of our board members, she actually helped develop the futures program in the U.S. as well. Jamila Parachi, she's done a lot of derivatives and this type of work, and we're starting to talk to financial organizations and institutions who want to jump into this space. But like I mentioned before, it's still a fairly new asset class, so people are still trying to figure it out. We feel that it will happen in the near future, but right now the only really pure play I mentioned are the 4 public companies in Canada.
I think a critic or a skeptic of voluntary carbon offsets would look at this and ask you, Sunny, how does this really help the environment? Because when you think about it, a large company or a company with a lot of cash can simply just pay more to emit more carbon. Or is that too simplistic to think about it that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that, but the way to think about it is that there are a lot of technologies and projects out there, especially in developing nations, that will never get kicked off the ground, that will never get to grow if it weren't for this financial vehicle called carbon credits. So those large corporations that are paying money to emit, well, even if they don't pay the money and there's no carbon credit market in place, they're still going to emit anyways. So it's not really doing any different. But by having carbon credits and essentially having the financial asset of those carbon credits and having these companies pay, well, it allows those other projects to accelerate. Because we know we have a pipeline of over 100 projects, and a lot of these projects wouldn't happen if it weren't for carbon credits and the stream of finances that comes with it.
How are the banks participating in this movement? Are you seeing more financing in this arena? Is this changing the way we're valuing companies? Because supposedly if a company is, let's say, emitting carbon, you would probably want to value this company lower because of the negative externalities, number one, but also the fact that they may have to pay more in carbon emissions.
Yeah, so there's a couple areas where the banks are participating. First, like you said, they're valuing companies differently based on their ESG scores and their emissions and their net zero commitments. Like I mentioned before, there's institutional investors that they even stated they will not invest in your organization if you don't have a good net zero score. On top of that, banks like the JP Morgan announcement, they're starting to make investments into carbon credits and carbon credit projects. And what I'm seeing more and more, banks are starting to have trading desks to buy and trade and sell carbon credits as well. Because again, it's a new asset class that is already massive, but it's going to become even bigger.
Do you think this is going to conflict with any sort of economic growth in the sense that now companies are a little bit hesitant to really invest in capital-intensive projects or expansions that may directly contribute to a lot of carbon? For example, let's say I was an EV company. I would be now looking twice at building a battery manufacturing plant. Or if I were a miner, I would be thinking twice about starting a new deposit because of what's going on now. And so ultimately, some would argue this may slow down not just growth, but also the bottom line for investors. How would you respond to that?
I would say that there's truth to that, depending on what the sector and where the growth is. If the growth is going to come at the expense of having additional emissions, like the mines that you mentioned, then yeah, it can stun it a little bit, but that's where carbon credits come in and can help that. Because, for example, if you're looking at making an investment into a new mine, there's ways to reduce the emissions from the mining process that will actually bring in revenue through the carbon credits. And then in other areas where, like the EV charger, for example, well, EV chargers themselves actually are able to generate carbon credits. So that would offset the emissions from, say, battery production or so forth, but also bring in revenue. So what we do is we come in and work with these technology companies like EV chargers and help bring in the carbon credits. We manage the entire process, which is very complicated, and that's why we do that. Well, hopefully we turn a cost center into a profit center by doing that.
Of the companies that you've worked with so far, Sunny, can you give us a few examples of very interesting or unique cases of how they've managed to reduce their carbon emissions?
Yeah, one that we recently signed a contract with and made an announcement is a company called Prosper. They do wastewater treatment, and they're able to do that at a energy reduction of up to 85%. That's very impactful because, first of all, every city in the world, David, does wastewater treatment, and it's one of the most energy intensive activity that any city undertakes. So if you go in and you offer a solution that reduces your energy consumption from this activity by 85%, not only the city paying a lot less for electricity, but we're able to generate carbon credits because by having less electricity usage, you have less emissions as well. So we're partnering with this company and helping them grow, but also taking them to a lot of multiple cities as well, because we're working with various jurisdictions, various municipalities, provinces, and part of it, what we do is we bring these technologies into these cities, for example.
So some of the biggest companies in the world have pledged or made net zero pledges, including Microsoft, Amazon, Google. So I'm looking at a lot of big companies, tech companies, Shell, General Motors. What do you think will be the dominant industry or types of companies that will need to buy carbon offsets the most? In other words, which companies do you think will have to have the most amount of carbon offsets and credits purchased because they emit the most emissions?
Yeah, the ones in the oil and gas space, like Shell you mentioned, they've already made a commitment that they'll buy 150 million carbon credits per year by 2030, because during the refinery and the processing of fuel and so forth, it generates tons of emissions. So that's one area. An area that's heavy industrial or heavy manufacturing is going to have tons of emission as well. Any industry that has transportation requirements and a lot of logistics will have a lot of emissions. So these are the type of companies that will be buying and purchasing quite a few carbon credits.
I think an investor of some of these companies that you were talking about might ask, well, is this going to impact not just their bottom line, but the prices for consumers? So suppose a tech company were paying a large chunk of their cash flow into carbon offsets. Would that not translate into price inflation?
It will, but I wouldn't say it's a huge amount of inflation. On the flip side, what I would say was it actually would help encourage consumers to spend more with these companies, because there's been surveys done that I've seen where up to 80% of people actually want to do something to help climate change, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. And what we're seeing is that in a lot of some of these retail type companies, the ones that are making a conscious effort to reduce their emissions are actually getting an increase in sales. So consumers are willing to spend an extra amount. So if anything, it's going to help their overall sales and bottom line.
Is there going to come a point in the near future where consumers will have to pay personal voluntary carbon credits? So if I were to purchase a plane ticket, I'd have to buy carbon credits to offset my footprint.
Yeah, so that is happening now on a very small scale. Your airline ticket is a great example. So there are quite a few airlines that allow you to pay an extra $10, $15 to offset your flight, and people are taking up on that option. What we're working on is we're actually working on working some projects with some large retailers as well, where consumers can have choices between two options of the same type of product, where one is a lower carbon and one's higher carbon. And if they pick a lower carbon, we actually can help aggregate that data and generate carbon credits and they get some type of rewards, or they can go and like you mentioned, pay an extra 10, 15, 25 cents or something in order to offset the carbon footprint from making that purchase. So we're starting to put that together for several companies.
Ultimately, this could be down the line a very tradable market, right? Suppose I were to buy, I don't know, X amount of carbon credits for my airline tickets over the next year. I would buy this product and it could be valued at, Y amount of dollars. And then I could, depending on demand and supply for the season, I could potentially sell this carbon offset product to somebody else who may need the plane ticket more than me. And so the value goes up. It's basically like a security.
You're absolutely right. That's how we're treating it. And that's why we add Jamila to our board as well, because of that angle. Right now, it's companies trading with each other and countries are coming into play, like I mentioned before. But I think in the very near future, it's going to be available for individuals like you and me and consumers as well. So you're absolutely right. And I think that's going to come sooner than later.
Well, which leads to my next question about regulations. Are regulators looking into this market, and how are they monitoring this development? I mean, $20 billion to $250 billion over the next 30 years is big growth. Certainly, they're looking into this.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And every government is looking into it in a different way. Some are looking at taking this and making it compliance eligible for their regions. Others are looking at ways to how they treat it as if it can be like a security, right? Or how are they going to tax it, things like that. So all that is happening because it is growing, like you said, I mean, by leaps and bounds. And then what you're going to see too is there's going to be an overlap between the voluntary and the compliance space, where in some compliance regions, voluntary markets will be eligible. And so now that adds an extra, extra little change into the whole mix as well. And then countries are now able to trade credits with each other through a requirement called ITMOS. So now some of these voluntary credits can be traded with other countries, which increases the value as well. So you get a lot of variables all kind of playing in the same time. So, a lot of change is going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. And I think it's going to be on the positive side because it's going to make the demand for credits much higher. And then also the need for credits is going to increase significantly.
Now, finally, let's talk about your company. Do you have any company updates for us or any upcoming projects that you can share with the audience?
Yes. So David, a lot has changed since we last spoke. And one of the big things is that we recently created a joint venture with a former member of parliament up in Canada and with his organization. And what that does is allows us access into all the different government jurisdictions from a municipal, provincial, and even federal level. And what we're doing is our initial engagements with 2 cities where we come in and look at all the activities that the cities are doing and budgeted for and identify ones that are eligible to generate carbon credits and provide a turnkey service where we generate the credits for them. And so our model's changed a little bit since we last spoke, because now rather than having a capital intensive model where we go and invest into these projects in return for credits, we're just providing a service because they don't need the CapEx. And so we provide a turnkey service and to generate, quantify, validate, and monetize the credits in exchange for a portion of the credits. So because we don't have to make any capital investment up front, the returns on these deals are much higher. The IRR is north of 100% sometimes, because our only cost is the cost to verify and certify the credits themselves. And what makes it really interesting is that it's very scalable, because once we prove it out with these 2 cities, we have several dozens of other cities behind it that wants to jump on board, both in the US and in Canada.
Well, Sunny, I appreciate your time and for educating us about the market and for shedding light on your company. And where can we learn more about your work? Your website, social media page?
Yeah, the website's the easiest way. So that's DevvStream.com, and it's, easy website. And if there's questions, then feel free to send in email to info@devvstream.com.
Okay, I'm just curious before we close off, actually, how do you pick your projects, the ones you work with?
Yeah, so we do almost zero biz dev because we're such a unique space. We get deals coming into us on deal flow 2 to 3 a week at least. And at this point, we have more projects we can handle. So what we look at is how much validity the projects are, and then how impactful and the size of the carbon credit generation. And so we have projects coming in that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Because I already told my team that we really can't take on any more projects within large organizations. Like for example, Ryoden is one that we made an announcement for. They're a $2 billion distributor of technology in Japan and subsidiary Mitsubishi. Well, they came and said, they want to start working with us, where we, like I mentioned before, with our new model, we act as their carbon credit agent and manager to generate credits for them for all their different projects.
Well, thank you again. And thank you for watching. We'll have more for you. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe.